Welcome everyone to XRM Virtual's Common Configurator Mistakes. My name is Daryl Labar. I'll be hosting the meeting today. Julie, I believe, is in Africa last time I checked, so I'm filling in for her this afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you happen to be at. So we are recording today, and we will post that on the events page once we're done. So watch a tweet from XRM Virtual once that's been posted, or you can just keep on checking the events page, and the link will show up there as well. We are always looking for speakers. XRM Virtual is a great place to get a first start at speaking if you've never spoke before. My first time doing any sort of speaking outside my company was at XRM Virtual just over 2 years ago, or just over 3 years ago, I think. So it's a great place to get started and practice and all that kind of fun stuff. So if you have a topic you'd like to present on, great. If you have a topic but you don't want to present, please let us know. You can email Julie Yak below at julie.yak@xrmvirtual.com, and we will find a speaker for what you are asking for. We have 2 more events scheduled. One in January, we're going through the integrations with Azure Service Bus with Abe, and then February 13th, future-proofing your configuration with Chris Huntingford. And then there are some conferences that are coming up in 2018 with the Extreme 365 in Dvornik. There is a call for speakers for that, so if you'd like to present on that, go ahead and go to that hyperlink. And then also we have CRM-UG Focus. That's in Indianapolis, May 21 to the 24th. I didn't even realize that until I was searching. I was like, oh, that's just down the road for me, so I should probably go to that. And then CRM-UG Dublin, EMA Summit Dublin is April 24th to the 26th. If there are any other conferences that we should know about, or anything that you would appreciate us posting, feel free to contact us as well. That brings us to our presenters for today. Joel Lindstrom is from Hitachi Solutions. He's a consulting principal for Hitachi, currently residing in Greenville, South Carolina, and is a 10-time CRM MVP, and is the CRM Audio Podcast Network founder and co-founder and contributor to CRM Tip of the Day. If you do not or are not aware of the CRM Audio Podcast Network, you are missing out on lots and lots of great CRM content, as well as CRM Tip of the Day. Our other presenter is Shawn, the CRM Hobbit Tabor, also from Hitachi. He is a 2-time Business Solutions MVP and a co-host on the CRM Audio Podcast, and has been working in Dynamic CRM since version 3. He is a specialist in all things service-related, field service, customer service, and project service. And Tony also wants to mention that Joel did win the CRM UG All-Star Award back in 2016 as well. So, yes, thank you so much, Shawn and Joel, for going and presenting today. Go ahead and take us off.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. Can you hear me okay, Daryl?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Great. Let me share my screen out and we'll get started. So the topic, we're qualified to talk about this topic because Shawn and I have made about every mistake you can make. And we're here to tell you how not to be like us and how to make all these mistakes. And not just, also don't want to talk about just the issue, but also kind of what's the solution for it. We identify, 10 of the most common issues, but then how can you avoid them, or how can you avoid these mistakes? The first thing we want to talk about, because this is kind of foundational, is performance. When you're going through a deployment of Dynamics 365, or if you're still on CRM, you may be tempted to look at all the great things that you can do, which you will be, and you'll see all these great tools out of the box, business rules, workflows, subgrids and subgrids and subgrids, and all this stuff that has a place and makes the system more usable. But when it comes down to it, you also need to consider performance, because you can have the most amazing functionality with iframes and web resources and all this great actions going on, but if you don't consider performance, if the system performs poorly and takes a long time to do things like open forms, save records, make changes, it's not a productivity tool. CRM, when done right, is a productivity aid, not a productivity detractor. And so you always want to make sure that you consider performance and weigh every configuration change, every customization, every integration, every workflow, not only with the functionality it brings you, but with what's the impact on performance. And so Microsoft gives you a few things out of the box that can help you with this. There's other third-party tools you can do, but we wanted to show you what you have, out of the box to begin with. One is this thing that's been in CRM for several years called the excuse me, goes by several different names, but it's the performance console. And so if you're in CRM, you got to do this in Internet Explorer. If you do this in Chrome, it will close the browser because Google can't use the same Alt F4 keyboard shortcut to close Windows as every other Windows application. So you want to, in Internet Explorer, pull up a record. I've got an account record. Once it loads, on your keyboard, hit Control-Shift-Q. That will bring this guy up. Now, the first time you bring it up, it will be blank. Then hit Enable down here, and then close this form. Then either hit F5 or refresh the record to reload the form. Once you do that, and it loads again, once again hit Control-Shift-Q. And now when it comes up, you'll see the same thing, only you'll see a lot of details on here. And every form component, and I'm having it open up another window here for some reason, so I'm going to go back here. Every form component, every function you have, every onload script, every embedded widget you might have, web resource, subgrid is going to show up on here, and you can see how many milliseconds does it take for it to load. Some of these are going to be longer lines, such as these are the complete load of the form here, but then you want to look at things at different pieces here, such as your onload scripts, such as your subgrids. And you can really see if there's, for example, a subgrid that's pulling up a slow loading view, you can see how it's disproportionately long. And it's a great way to load your customization and get a quick look at what is happening there. Now, there's third-party tools that get more in depth, but since you have this out of the box, this is a good basic first check. After you finish your form configuration, see how long does it take after I've loaded that, and get a good look. You also though want to consider where are your users coming from, because if you have people in remote locations, maybe you have multiple geographies and you have people in different continents and other places, or people that live in remote areas, they might have worse performance. So I'd recommend, if you have people in several different geographies, doing this in all those locations to get a handle on what's going on in those locations. And if you find it's extra slow in one area, another great tool is the network diagnostics. This lets us, and you go to the URL, and my deck has the URL, but you basically prepend your URL and then tools diagnostics diag.aspx. And that'll give you this page, and I can hit run, and it's going to do a test to see how many milliseconds of latency between me and the server, what's my bandwidth, other things like that. This is very useful for testing your latency for things like JavaScript and other things from different locations. And chances are people that are having the worst performance probably are the people who have the highest latency. So from that, once you have that information and details and metrics around how long different parts of the form are taking to load, then you can do things like optimizing the latency, optimizing your configuration for performance purposes. Things like if you got 1 million subgrids, put them in a collapsed tab. That way they don't render when you first open the form. Also, I find that's helpful to do things like insights powered by Inside View. That's very useful for the salespeople, but the people who aren't selling and prospecting, having that open when the form opens for contacts and accounts and leads might be slowing them down some. So that's where in some cases we've decided let's keep Inside View, but let's put in a collapsed tab when it loads so that we don't impact people's performance. I like to put all the, you got on your account, you got related cases, opportunities, activities, things like that. I like in some cases to put them all in a collapsed tab called related records. That way the form loads really fast, and then people can click into it to see what's next. All right, Shawn?
Thanks, Joel. So along with performance, it's really important to consider optimal user experience when designing a CRM solution. So as some of you may know, when you configure CRM for a living, it's possible to really have a disconnect there between the user experience and what you're trying to do for the real user. You can really easily design functionality that meets the letter of the requirement, but it is not anywhere near optimal for user experience. So here's an example. If you have to click to open a form, you save it, then you click and open another form, you go back to the original form to complete a process. It's not giving warm and fuzzies for a user experience, right? You want that to be a more seamless, more intuitive process. It also is going to create some potential confusion over where the user is in the process. So when configuring CRM, standards of good user experience design should really be followed at all times. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those in a minute. The application design should give the users the most critical information at the top of the form, follow consistent form design, not use excessive required fields, make sure that complete processes can be finished without having to click through multiple forms, etc. So, because something really important to remember, in most cases, CRM is an optional system. And if you do not enjoy using the system, or if you're not finding value in using the system, as a user, you're not going to use it, right? So we really need to configure systems in a way that benefits that quick knowledge of the value, the quick understanding of how this is going to benefit them. So, some of the things I've experienced in some of my projects, when you have a lot of data entry that's necessary, whether it's required fields or it's just we're not carrying over data from related fields or entities. So here's an example. You go to enter in an opportunity, and you choose the customer. That could be obviously an account or a contact. If I have information related to that customer, such as phone number, address, any of that kind of minutia that I can pull over from the customer entity that I populated, I should do that, because otherwise you're going to get double entry. You're most likely not going to get entry into those fields if it's necessary for your business process, or you could get incorrect information. So by taking those kind of steps and pulling in information where possible, autofilling information, ensuring that the flow of the form provides an opportunity to get the most relevant information possible. Another good example, if there's some required information that you need on a form, don't put it at the very bottom. If you have to have it, bring it to the front, bring it to the top. Make sure it's very clear and focused on where that needs to be entered. You could also, this can also be benefited by using business process flows. Through the stages of the process, if you're indicating those values that you need to capture right in the business process flow, you're much more likely to achieve success in getting the users to enter that information. Removing unused components and links. If there's parts and pieces of the form that are out of the box that you don't need, get rid of them. If you find through just managing your implementation that people are not using sections or pieces of functionality within a form, you really need to, on an ongoing basis, evaluate those forms and streamline them. Remove sections and areas that are not being used that just add clutter. And to that end, remove white space. Look at things like when you have the social pane on the form. Depending on how you position that, it can create a large amount of white space on your form. So make sure that you're balancing the other columns on the left and the right to appropriately collapse the white space where necessary. V9 does a lot of things to improve that white space, but unfortunately sometimes it creates gray space because we can color the spaces. But so keep that in mind when you're designing your forms. And as always, monitor your user adoption. Monitor how they're working through the forms. I had a long time ago, I had a situation where my boss had me go down to my support area to find out what it was that they were getting calls on about the forms and about the objects that we were documenting information on, so that I could take that back and retrofit the forms through various releases. It's important to get that feedback and keep that communication with your users.
Yeah, and I think just to add, I think there's a lot to be said about consistency. I always shudder a little bit when I see people have dramatically different form layouts between cases, opportunities, and accounts and contacts.
Yeah.
Because you got to think, if I have a standard layout, and I don't think the standard Dynamics 365 form layout is perfect, but say this for it, it's consistent. So if you learn how to use the case form, you can jump to opportunity or account and pretty much know what's what, where the activities are, where the notes are. Where if you have a lot of different stuff up on top, and in one the activities are down on the bottom, another are on the side, you're going to make your system much harder to use.
Right.
And a lot of this,
I always try.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I always try to group those critical pieces in similar formats across all the forms, so that way, to your point, it makes it really easy and understandable for whatever form you're on. This is the area I need to enter information in.
Right. And another thing you'll see with where Microsoft's going with the newest release in both the unified interface and the refresh of the web UI is they're trying to be much more accessibility friendly for people with disabilities like visual impairments. So that's why you see borders coming back around sections and fields, and clearly indicating where there's a field and where data can be entered. And I think that's important, underscoring this too, because you can take a highly accessible platform and make it less accessible by designing things, putting too much on a form, making it hard to use. I think as a configurator, you should try to think like a web designer as much as possible. And I'm not a web designer. I don't claim to be, but I have read. There's some good websites about UX and user experience. Read up on things like usability differences between side labels versus top labels. Top labels are much more readable. Your eyes don't have to move back and forth as much. And also things like the required fields. There was one study I read where I think it was eBay or Amazon eliminated one required field from one of their account sign-up forms and got something like 20 to 30% more completions of that form. So things like that do matter.
Absolutely.
Next, ignoring mobile. Now, mobile has been a big part of my Dynamics life, going back to 2013 when the original CRM for tablets was released, which became Dynamics 365 Mobile. It was kind of got thrown in there because we deployed it right after it came out, and I found that half the stuff in it wasn't documented, and there were all these quirks and differences about how it worked. But still today, I still see people where mobile is kind of an afterthought. And they say, yeah, we they can use mobile, but we're not really going to stress it. We're not going to promote it, or say no, we're not going to use mobile, but we're online, and so the next day somebody downloads the Dynamics 365 mobile app from the store, and they have a bad experience. And one of the things that I've done, because it is a recurring feature on CRM Tip of the Day, is reviewing the reviewers, where I'll take a review from the usually the iOS App Store, but I've also done it with the Windows Store, and it's getting better, but traditionally there have been a lot of negative reviews for Dynamics 365 Mobile. And some of them are valid because there have been some quirks. Fortunately, a lot of those quirks are ironed out in the latest releases. But I would say probably 40%-ish of them are things that are not core faults of the app, but either the administrator has done things like set their logout timeout very short so that they're having to constantly enter their passwords. Forms aren't working or getting errors, which will happen if you don't plan for it. So the net takeaway is, even if you don't see your users doing their primary job on mobile, you need to think about it before you deploy and before users start using the system. At least making sure that the sitemap is laid out in an optimal way. Now, this is a couple of these I'll have to put caveats on if you're on 8.2 or earlier, or if you're on v9. If you're on 8.2 or earlier, it uses an architecture called Mocha, where it's rendering the same website and the same application, but a different rendering engine. Because of when it was built 5 years ago plus, we had things were different then. Usually your devices had lower power. You were on slower connections, so it did things like caching the metadata. So you connect, it says, please wait while you download the metadata. That can be 4 or 5 minutes sometimes, and then every time you publish, it pops up and says, hey, there's changes, should I download them? Kind of a frustrating experience. And things were just different. There were things like require the certain fields, like the filtered lookups, didn't work the same. There were all these differences. One of them was the sitemap. If you're on 8.2, keep in mind you can lay out the sitemap whatever order you want and use privilege tags and XML to hide, show things. None of that's going to matter on mobile. If it's enabled for mobile and it's on the sitemap, even way down in the depths of the settings area, it's going to show on the mobile sitemap. And so that means that if you're on 8.2, you need to make some trade-offs. One of the big ones is, I recommend, if you got those entities, they're just lookup lists, like industry list, country list, state list, don't put them in the sitemap. First of all, if you need to add a new country, that's going to be extremely rare. But if you say you need to add a new industry, you can do that just as easily with Advanced Find than clicking on settings. It'll lead to a cleaner environment. Now, the difference there with v9 is v9 renders the same sitemap that you have in your App Designer app module if it's a unified interface app. So it gives you full sitemap, same thing, same experience. It's much better. You still don't want to make sure it works well on a smaller device. And that's the second thing, optimize form layouts and et cetera for a good mobile experience. You need to know what devices they're using it on. Are people using it on a fancy iPhone 10? Are they using it on a 3-year-old iPhone 6? How are they using it, and what do they need on mobile? Even if they have the latest and greatest v9, I would argue you probably, on a smaller device, don't want everything you have on your computer with the 30-inch monitor. And so that's the good thing about v9 being able to use App Designer. If you're not familiar with App Designer, you need to be. And I think there's been some other sessions and definitely some CRMEG sessions about App Designer. But App Designer gives us the ability to take the big monolithic app and create focused experiences that only have specific links, forms, views, dashboards. And you can have a specific one for mobile that gives you a more tailored experience. Validate that form scripts work correctly. As a general rule, most form scripts work. However, there are certain advanced functions that don't. The biggest problem here is, though, by default, mobile pre-V9 has a limit of 75 fields and 5 tabs and there's so many subgrids as well. I don't remember all of them. But the biggest thing that trips people up with this is your form script calls a field that's on the bottom of the form, and because of the 75 field limit, that field's not on the form, so it throws an error. So you want to test, and that's the biggest thing, is test to make sure that what you have works well in mobile, that you're not getting errors. At least pull up every form you have. But then finally, make it more usable with touch and mobile. And you can do that with these great visual controls. In Dynamics 365, there are several visual controls. Things like there's a website preview. Actually, let me jump in and show you kind of where that is quickly here. So if I go back to my CRM environment, and I got to go back to my, I'm going to disable this so it doesn't slow me down, and close it. If I'm on, say, the form layout, the form configurator here, and you go to the properties of the field, for example, website. In the properties, you've got this thing called controls. And there's several different controls you can add. And this differs based on the kind of field you have. Input mask, that's like if I want to change what I'm entering into, like format telephone numbers into a specific mask. Multimedia control, if I have a field like with a URL for a video, say a YouTube video, I can put that on. Then when I look at it in mobile, I'm going to see and be able to play that video right in line with the form. I saw a really cool example using the multimedia control where it was some kind of an industrial or manufacturing deployment, and on the product record they had a hyperlink field where they put a link to the video for that product. And so then the people out in the field or people on their mobile devices in the plant could pull that up and could play the video right in line there. Website preview, I think everybody should add that for the like company website, because what it does is it gives you a nice little preview. So for example, if we enter Microsoft.com, it'll give us the first few lines of the website. That's really helpful, when I'm learning about this account. I don't want to click through. I just want to see the first few lines so I know who are these people, what do they do. Add these kind of controls. There's a lot of other ones. There's sliders for number controls. There's date pickers. There's visual pick list fields. There's a lot of different things. I like the sliders for things like annual revenue. And by doing that, what we're doing is going from an okay mobile experience to one optimized for mobile and touch. And your users and usability will be much greater with that. Now, one thing I'll mention, currently, this is only phone and tablet for 8.2, but if you're on V9, since V9 uses the unified interface, if you have people in the browser using a unified interface app module, and some of you will know what I mean by that, some of you won't, but basically there's this new UI that is introduced with V9, along with the traditional web UI, that gives you all the things, the goodies for mobile can be used in the browser or the new Outlook app as well. So I'd recommend looking at that, and take the time. It doesn't have to be months and months of work. It could be, I'm going to dedicate the next 2 days to mobile optimization. I'm going to turn on some visual controls. I'm going to do some other things, and through that, we'll get it to be a much better, much more usable mobile experience.
And part of that experience is understanding from a high level executive and sponsor level what the critical features are for getting that buy-in. Getting acceptance in your implementation goes a long way from the start of the project all the way through to go live. You want to make sure that you're engaging those folks, identifying those sponsors, identifying those advocates, and advocating with them early, getting them on board. Like we said before, CRM in a lot of cases is an optional system. So getting them on board early and helping them understand the benefits and why you would want to have your users going into CRM and really engaging with the system is critical. I've had many implementations where one of the first things that happened for whatever situation is training gets minimized. That's a critical mistake that could cause a lot of problems down the road. Have a good understanding of not only the capabilities of your customer or your own business for what capabilities you have for training, but also look at what training mechanisms, what learning processes your user base engages with the most. For example, I had an implementation years ago where the user base was very, very big on distributed learning. So videos, online resources. They weren't so much for one-on-one or classroom type training. So by understanding those things ahead of time, getting that buy-in for the investment from the executives and from your sponsors goes a long way of making sure that your implementation is launched and supported in the right way. Empowering users. This is a big deal. There's quite often times where you're going to have users of varying degrees of interest. To where you could have a level, if you're lucky enough to have a level of engagement that you would distinguish as a power user. By designing your system in a way that they can engage with the system and help drive not only data quality, but processes and the way that the system is successful with other users is very, very important to a successful implementation. Don't shy away from engaging with those power users to understand their requirements and working with the IT group to help them understand how we can support those power users in a safe and responsible way in terms of the implementation. I've run into a number of situations where I have power users that want to be very, very involved and very, very engaged, but IT sometimes pushes back. And that's understandable. There's policies and procedures. And again, this goes back to user buy-in, getting that buy-in from the executive sponsors, getting buy-in from leadership to understand why it's going to benefit the implementation as a whole, the company, the business processes, the ROI by engaging these power users or other users who want to be able to assist and help with the success of that implementation.
It's always a red flag when I meet with a client and they say, the users are too busy, so I know what they want. I'm going to tell you what they want, or I got the spreadsheet put together that says I want to track activities. And too often CRM has been looked at as a management tool with very little thought of what's the value to the users. And you've never seen somebody who's a top salesperson for years get fired because they won't use CRM. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. I had a situation years ago when I worked at a financial services firm where compliance they wanted to make CRM a compliance tool, right? And that's the very first way to get a financial advisor or a wealth manager to say, yeah, I'm not going to be using that. So what we did is we engaged some of the wealth managers and the financial advisors to say, what could you do what could we do to get the compliance oversight that's needed and get you to enter that data so that compliance can find value in this system as well. And what they said is, well, instead of having to print out every email that I've sent to a customer in the last 6 months when they do an audit, can they look at that stuff in the CRM system? And sure enough, we could. So we enabled that business process, and that gave value to everybody, and that increased adoption significantly. The last thing I'd mention on user buy-in is relationship insights. Now, it's still somewhat in a preview state, so be cautious there. But There's a lot of information that can be surfaced with relationship insights, leveraging the action cards, and if you're able to have an online exchange environment as well as online CRM, you can take advantage of auto capture, and you can take advantage of the email engagement as well. These tools give you a lot of bang for the buck for your user experience from an individual standpoint. So when I come into the system, I see very specific insights to myself and how I'm dealing with this relationship, hence the name. So take a look at that, and I think there's been I think my presentation from CRM Summit is up on the site, so take a look at that as well. But a lot of functionality and capability with relationship insights to really engage with your customers and enable a lot of opportunities for further engagement.
Great. Over-engineering processes. This is where frequently what is motivated by a good intent of making the system easier or making the system more, more foolproof, if you will. We're going to think of every potential outcome and automate it with a workflow that creates a task that, when that one's closed, creates another task which fires off a workflow, which then, using JavaScript pops up to focus on this next part of the form. Training wheels on top of training wheels on top of training wheels. Or you see the business process flow that is longer than the form because you've got more fields on it and you have every single field that it could possibly do. Thinking back to CRM version 3, I always hated the old sales process workflows because they were designed not by somebody who'd actually worked in sales, but more from a, let's find a way to over-automate everything. And while they could work, they irritated people because, salespeople, especially once they get familiar with the system, they will have their own ways of doing things. And by over-engineering the processes, we're forcing them to stay in that area, or we may be sheltering them from really learning the system. That's why from time to time people will come up with some kind of a replacement for CRM's navigation. I'm always a little bit leery of those things because that is in essence, creating an extra dependency on something that, well, it may make it more simple for first-time users. Long run, it's going to probably slow the system down, frustrate users by stifling them by something that ultimately may not fit every specific scenario. It's better to look at what are the main steps in the process. Use stages for the main stages, the prospect, qualify, close type stages. Then have the main events that happen in those, the main milestones that happen in those. I don't even like some of the case, like for example, the case process flow has, in my opinion, too much stuff for most people. It puts the customer there, the contact. It has a lot of fields up there that are right below it on the form and may not apply to every single case. And so, I'm a big fan of simplification. And business process flows can go a long way. And I think business process flows are great because they serve two purposes. One is for the new user, they can be those training wheels and can highlight, here's the most important stuff you need to do. And if it's something that has to happen, we have a regulation that we have to have this form signed before we can go to the next stage. It's great to put a checkbox there to say it's done. But I don't like putting too much weight on the business process flow to say, for example, have a lookup for every single activity they've got to create and relate it there. That gets over complicated. Use processes for what they're good for. I'll admit it. First year I was a CRM consultant back in 2007. I made a 65-step workflow. It was terrible. And when you get more than 10 to 20 steps in a workflow, each additional step slows down the editor. So it would take like 2 minutes to open up a step to change it. So we quickly changed that, went with a plugin. Make sure what you're doing, is, if it's helpful for new users, make sure it's not making power users' lives more difficult. I'm a fan of minimizing the use of wait conditions. Now, I'll admit, wait conditions have value, and I like them for shorter term waits. So if I need to have something happen a day later, after this happens, do something a day from now, I'm okay with that, especially if you use some of the like timeout functions. If having a wait condition on modified date or anything like that, number one, you'll slow the system down. But what you gotta know about wait conditions are when you modify the workflow, any existing wait conditions are left in the original definition. So if I have something, send this email template when this happens, and then I change the workflow to send a different email template, then it's going to still send the one that's sent. So I'm a big fan of using other tools for those longer term, conditions. For example, Microsoft Flow has some interesting uses where you can have a scheduled job that gets records that meet a certain condition on a recurring basis and then do something or trigger a workflow with it. If you do need to use a wait condition for a longer running process, separate the wait logic from the execution logic. So if I have that wait condition that sends out an email, don't put the send email step in that workflow, put it in a child workflow. Then you can edit the definition of what happens, and it will trigger, the original workflow will trigger that with the updated logic. But again, I would say I'm also a fan of, so for example, I want to have once a month or once every week, I want to send something out to people that had a birthday this week. I've used things like Scribe jobs or SSIS jobs with Kingsway Soft to get the list of people and then have that job trigger a workflow. It's better for performance. It also is a little bit more flexible and doesn't overload the system quite as much. Shawn?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I had to come off mute there. Another thing to keep in mind when you're planning or implementing Dynamics 365 is the roadmap. I'll give you a story. About 6 years ago, this was not that big of a deal because once maybe every couple of years we had some significant functionality come out for the system. Now, pretty much kind of on clockwork, you're getting every 6 months some significant functionality either in the online space or on-prem. So it's very, very important to identify and understand those key features and capabilities that Microsoft is working on that could enhance your implementation without having to create custom functionality, or understanding what's coming in the roadmap and how it pertains to your business so that you can make that educated decision on whether or not to create custom functionality. So things you want to make sure to do is, as you're planning your implementation, looking at how that roadmap is going from a Microsoft perspective by going to the roadmap site on the Microsoft site, as well as building an internal roadmap for custom development. Look at short and long-term goals on where you're wanting to be with your implementation, where you're wanting to be with certain business areas and their functionality. Try to, in my experience, trying to work within set business processes and planning roadmaps in that fashion helps a great deal in communicating that benefit and understanding how we're proceeding through the roadmap internally with your client, as well as layering on top of that the Microsoft roadmap. It helps a vision come about in terms of the overall internal product vision. Every phase that Microsoft releases new capabilities and new functionalities, go back to that roadmap with your client and look at it. Make adjustments. Identify areas where you can take advantage of new functionality and new capability that you may not have understood or knew about before. Great example is editable grids a few releases ago. For a while, there was no editable grid capability outside of the opportunity form, and it was very restricted. When editable grids was released, it opened up a whole new opportunity to improve the user experience for your clients, adding that control and avoiding some custom development. Now, in my personal situation, I had a couple projects where the requirements didn't quite line up with the editable grid. So we did have to go with something custom, but we're keeping an eye on that roadmap and understanding where we're going with editable grids and the custom control framework to help us understand where that custom functionality may need to be retired in the future, or maybe need to be amended with a hybrid of out-of-the-box new capabilities coming down the road with customization. And again, evaluate every request you get from a client with an eye on the future roadmap, because you want to avoid creating functionality custom and then having to either undo it or have something come out in a very short order, like 3 to 6 months, that is just as good, if not better. That's just frustrating to your client, frustrating to you, and can cause some consternation with your user base. So keep an eye on those roadmaps. Build your internal roadmaps, short and long-term goals with a focus, and that will help you build a successful implementation every time.
Yeah, and underscore the first one. If you're a company that uses Dynamics 365 or CRM and you don't have a real roadmap, you're just kind of going along, adding things here and there, you need to get a roadmap and say, where are we really going here? Evaluate your customizations you put together. That's how you avoid having a system that over time becomes unruly or with it lacking direction or has a lot of cruft from previous stuff. And then, if tell your partner, I want to review the roadmap every 6 months. Schedule a meeting for every March and October and say, let's look at where's Microsoft going, and look at, first thing is there anything we can simplify? So look at all the goodies we've gotten over the last, few years. Roll-up fields, calculated fields, voice of the customer surveys, etc. Editable grid control. Ask the question: can we replace any of this custom stuff with out-of-the-box stuff? Can we replace any of our JavaScript with business rules? The answer: can we replace, our third-party editable grid with any of the places we're using that with the out-of-the-box editable grid? The answer might not be we can totally do away with this customization, but even if you replace it in 4 or 5 places, you're going to make your system perform better and, more importantly, make future upgrades easier. And since Microsoft's in the rapid release cycle, you want to make your upgrades as easy as possible. The more standard stuff you can go to, the better. Next, using the wrong tool for the job. Our motto is there are no bad tools, but every tool has a place. And so kind of the life cycle of a CRM configurator. They get started, they learn configuration, and they're enamored by the power of workflows and marketing lists and advanced find and all the great out-of-the-box tools. But then they run into a situation where they do a workflow and it gets triggered for 100,000 plus records, and then nothing works for half a day because the async service is backlogged. Then they learned how to write their first plugin, and then the light comes on and say, wow, now I know all the real goodies. And then they look at everything as a plugin. So 2 extremes there that you want to avoid. One is having a tool like a workflow that you try and do everything with. And I can give you examples where all those tools I mentioned, marketing lists. I had somebody try and run a dynamic marketing list for 1 million records. Even a static marketing list for 1 million records doesn't work. It'll time out. Or advanced find. You get, again, usually a lot of records in there, and you try and use it as a big data tool. It's not designed for that. But there again, if you have, look at everything as a problem that needs a plug-in, you're going to be equally disappointed, because your environment will become more and more complicated. It will become slower running, and it'll be impossible to upgrade because you're going to have without a large effort, large expense. So again, no bad tools, but you want to look at what's the experience requirement, what is the functional requirement, what's the performance requirement. So even things like real-time versus background process workflows. I've had debates going on. I think we did it on one of the podcast episodes. Which is better performing, background processes or real-time workflows? And the answer is yes. Depending on what you mean, both can be. If you have something where it has to happen immediately for, or the business process fails, real time is, more fast and it doesn't overload the async process. But if you have a process that is, 3, 4, 5 steps long with a bunch of conditional logic, you'll reach a point where real-time workflows fail, especially if you run them on multiple records at the same time. And so that's where don't be the person that looks at every problem as a nail. Look at each problem. Look at here's the available options. I always ask, why not? Why can't we use out-of-the-box tool X? That's if the answer is there's no good reason other than I want to write some plugins today, we use the out-of-the-box tool if it performs well and does what we need. But if there's a legitimate reason, then what's our best option? Then we call in the real developers and have them suggest a solution. And one of some things I look at is how many entities are involved in the process. Some of the stuff like weight conditions, you've got to use background processes for, but others you can use either. And I probably tend more for background processes unless there's a real reason it needs to be real time. But then if it involves a lot of records or multiple or a lot of entities, those are all factors that should be considered.
There's one thing that drives me crazier than anything in an implementation, and that's not testing. I've run into this a number of times, and sometimes it's not intentional, clearly. But it's very, very important to ensure that you're testing your configurations before you roll them out, especially to production. I always follow a methodology of, if I'm the configurator and I create a field or I create a form or I create a business rule, what have you, I test it myself and then I pass it on to a peer to make sure they test it. So that we get, you can test multiple users, multiple roles, right? And then you can promote it to the next environment. That's typical developer integration testing. Then you go to system testing, the standard DIT testing model. But you want to definitely track any defects and what you're doing to remediate those issues. So good documentation on what it is you created, what it is you tested, what the results were, what your expected results are, so that you can build those test scripts so that it's reproducible for other people. This is very important because if you only have a single person creating everything and testing everything, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have, well, everything works. Because I had to do this and this, but I knew that because I created it, so it works. Whereas with another user, they may not understand this 8 steps B, C, and D that you had to create that aren't documented to get the functionality to work as you expected. Test in all browsers. We're now in a world where we have a brand new Firefox that's super fast. We have Google Chrome that by all intents and purposes is probably one of the standards you're going to find out there, most widely used. And then, of course, we have Internet Explorer. We want to test in all these browsers because they do behave and act differently. While they're supported, different little nuances can appear, and we need to make sure they're documented. And what I try to do, this isn't always possible given constraints of the project, but what I try to do is get standards across each of the browsers. What's your standard resolution? What's your standard monitor size? What's your standard user configuration? Do they have managed desktops? Those kind of things. The more you can narrow that scope down, the more potential you have of executing really successful test scripts and have a much better testing effort going forward, especially in mobile as well. When you're testing in mobile, understand all the different footprints that you have. Is it all iOS? Is there Android involved? Do we have a mixture of phones and tablets? What versions of iOS do we have? What versions of Android do we have? Because they all are different, right? By narrowing and focusing down your test potential of iOS's, browsers, different operating systems, different types of devices, whether they're tablet or phones. That all helps in getting a good profile of your user and getting a profile of your test scenarios to where you can be more successful.
All right, we're running short on time, so I think we need to put the speed on here.
Test a lot. Go.
Lack of change control. Configuring in production. Don't do it. It's tempting to do it, especially when the boss, especially the CEO, says, "I need to have this new field or this new set option added. Now jump in and do it." But you're asking for trouble. Even if you make small changes, you're going to get your environments out of sync, and you have the risk of either making it so your configuration can't be imported easily, or you overwrite changes when you bring them in. So never make changes in production. And make sure that you regularly refresh your non-production sandboxes as well, just in case something configured in production. Limit how many administrators you have. Use solutions. Don't just go in and customize the default solution. Most deployments, unless you're deploying things that are ISV solutions that will be deployed across multiple different environments, you'll use unmanaged solutions. But again, don't configure in production. Shawn?
You might be on mute, Shawn.
Thanks, Daryl. Fit and finish is really important. Don't forget it. You want to make sure that when you create new objects, you're adding the appropriate icons. When you're creating attributes, you're entering descriptions in the description field for those attributes, so you get the appropriate tooltips to help your users navigate through the system. View layouts. I try to look for consistency, get a good format across all the views for a given entity, and standardize them accordingly. Obviously, you're going to have some variances there, but try to keep those to a minimum. Remove unused nav links. If you're not using service, take it out. This is a great place where you can take advantage of App Designer and create those user experience-based apps. Same with the sitemap layout, and App Designer is huge. So use that. Theme your environments. Make sure it's consistent with your marketing team and their color palettes. It really helps the user experience and gives them a buy-in to make sure they feel like that really is their own environment. And if you rename entities, do go all the way. Don't go halfway. Rename them in all the views, rename them in all the supporting entities and lookups. Make sure you don't say company in one place and account in 15 others. That's important. It reduces confusion and make sure that you have a consistent look and feel across the entire system.
A little tip on that last one. One tip of the day we had was to leverage the translation file for that. Because if you export the translation file for the account entity and you're changing account to company, you can do a find replace and change account to company. Then every error message and every message and dialogue and view and everything in the system that says account will now say company. So that's one way that can make that easier. Without doing that, it's easy to forget something, especially the entity messages and error messages and system dialogues. So that's our last slide. So I guess to summarize, I'll repeat: don't configure in production. Think of users, involve users early and often. Think of user experience. Make sure CRM is developed as a user-driven system, not just an administrative and IT-based system. And based on that, your user adoption will be higher, and your configurations will be more widely adopted.
Indeed.
And we got a minute for questions. Anybody have a question?
Rapid fire.
All right. So you can find us if you want to go to CRM Audio. You can find us crm.audio. It's also on iTunes and Google Play and all those good things. Shawn is at CRM Hobbit on Twitter, and I am at Joel Lindstrom on Twitter.
And thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today. It's great.
Thank you very much, Shawn and Joel, for lending your expertise and for going through this really extensive list of things to do for configurators. Really appreciate it. And once again, I will be posting the recorded video on the site for XM Virtual, on the site for this meeting. You'll see a link there, and I will post it on Twitter as well on the at XRM Virtual tag. So, thank you, everyone.
All right.